Be the right club. Be the right club today. Yes!
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Be the Right Club Today podcast. Super excited about our next guest, Mr. Raymond Prior. Raymond Prior is a performance consultant based out of Chicago, works with a bunch of tour players, works with a bunch of high-level business execs, works with actresses. Anybody that's interested in performing at a higher level, Raymond's your guy. Raymond, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. I know we just started, but I got to say this is a deeply threatening experience for me because I usually only agree to podcasts where I'm the best looking person. So already I'm starting at a place of a deficit. So, just want you to know that's starting from.
How was he talking about, you or me? Because we can't both be better looking than him. There's
Hey, let's not debate it. Who cares? Must be this new beard I'm sporting here.
Hey, nice. I mean, it's very well groomed now.
Oh, I hate it. I did it as a weight loss thing because I can't stand it. It's motivating me to lose some weight.
Oh, you've got, if I do this, then I'll get rid of this type of thing going on?
Yeah, you know about that sort of thing, don't you?
Sure.
So, Raymond, let's get started with this. When I was playing, I only had one coach. And when I was playing the tour, now we have lots of coaches. So detail, what is a performance coach? What is your job?
Well, I'll just start by saying I hate that term because that doesn't really encompass it. I am of the opinion that most people in high performance are surrounding themselves with too many people. The term I use with my job is performance consultant. And if we're just talking about high performance, there are three things we can train. We can train our body. That's all the things we do for rest and recovery, diet and exercise. It's also building our strength and flexibility, et cetera, to be able to meet the demands that our sport or our craft requires. We can train our craft, that is by literally learning the physical and strategic skills to be able to execute when we need to and how we want to. And we can train our mind. And the best performers in the world are not leaving any of those three up to chance, right? Or at least until they run into the point where they now have to in order to be able to continue to survive. My job is to help them understand and train that third leg, which is their mind. My area of expertise is human psychology, particularly as it relates to performance and how much we enjoy the experiences that we have in our lives. And my job is to help them fill that in. And I take a pretty comprehensive approach to that so that they can take that comprehension and then simplify it in real time when they need it.
So Raymond, we talked to Brett McCabe on here, and I asked him a question. He works with the Alabama football team and then works with a bunch of golfers too. And I asked him a question: how does he work with different athletes? Golf's so different than a lot of other sports, and how do you separate the task when you're coaching these people? How do you separate the task or the goal with regards to the mental game, with regards to what they're trying to do mentally? And if we need to stay specific to different sports, then that's fine. But I've always thought that golf was in its own world compared to more reactionary sports like a baseball or football or whatever else.
I think it can be. So what I would say to that, Chase, is that I approach every client that I have differently, in that understanding that humans have different experiences. They are nuanced and they're complicated in ways. So if I assume you're a golfer, this must be your experience. You're a football player in a more quote unquote reactionary sport and a team environment, everything, like if I start making assumptions, it's really easy for me to start guessing. And I'm not very good at my job when I guess, like most people aren't, right? What I want to do when I'm working with a client to begin with is really start to understand that person and their experience. And that includes asking about, what kind of environment are you in? What are the demands in that environment? What is a little about your psychological framework, the way you think, and asking questions like, what do you want? Like, what's important to you? Because if I assume every golfer I work with wants to play on the PGA Tour, I'm going to be wrong a lot. And then I'm helping them move towards something that isn't authentic to them. If it's in a team environment, I also don't want to make assumptions about that environment that may or may not be true for that person. So I think it's less about what they're doing and more starting with what is that person interested in and what are the barriers they're experiencing, what are the things they're good at, and then how does that apply to their environment afterward. And as you start working in performance for long enough, you start to understand that there are very few performance problems that stand alone. There's overlap between all of them, hence performance psychology, not just sports psychology. We're all performing at different times and in different ways in our lives. And there are some common threads between many of them. My job with clients is try to figure out where those common threads have individuality and personalization for each of them, so that I'm tailoring the work I'm doing with them to who they are and what they're trying to do. There's going to be commonalities. There are also always differences.
So when you're working with, let's say, tour players, let's talk about the commonalities that you see. You know, we've said on here that tour players are just as fragile as 20 handicaps are, or maybe more fragile just because their results, allow them to put food on the table. What are some of the commonalities, some of the mental column issues that you see that are common among tour players, and specifically, what are things that you do to help people get out of their rut when they're struggling, and things that you do to keep them in their peak performance when they're playing really well?
Yeah, so you hit on a really important thing. I think it's important for us to understand that people are successful because of many things. They're also successful in spite of many things. It is a misconception to think that just because somebody is a tour level player, that their psychology is always helping them. Just like it'd be a mistake to think that their swing is also helping them all the time. So the commonalities, tour players are human beings. They experience the same insecurities, the same struggles, the same difficulties focusing in high stakes environments that everybody else does, whether you're working in a factory or whether you're supposed to play golf on Saturday and Sunday. We're all humans and we're all performing. That those are similar. What's different for tour players, as you said, is they're in a high stakes environment that is, if they don't perform well, they don't get invited back to the party. And while, yes, they get to make a lot of money if they're doing it well for long enough and consistently enough, the tours are in a really high stakes, high stress environment that will chew you up and spit you out if you are not training all three legs and good at all three of them. And there are other environments that are very similar to that, but then there are most working environments do not have that level of high stakes and risk, right? And so what was the second part of your question there that you had asked? When your players are struggling, how do you get them out? When they're playing great, how do you keep them in that state? Yeah. So the first thing is, one of the things I work with, I take a little bit of a different approach than I think most people that I've interacted with in a similar job to mine, is that I'm going to take a much more comprehensive approach to understanding your own psychology. Because the answer to your question is both and, which is, if I really understand my psychology, the things that create barriers and the things that allow me space and access to what I'm good at, I can do both at the same time, right? When I'm doing things that are making it easier for me to execute the way that I want to play more freely and to have more stable confidence, to be present more often, then when those are happening, I understand why they're happening and I can keep it going. At the same time, when I start to get, a little bit shaky on the rails, I can recognize them sooner, and then I can make simpler and sooner adjustments to be able to get back to where I want to be. But in order to do that, an in-depth and comprehensive understanding of your psychology is important. You don't need to be a neurologist or a psychologist to do so, but a lot of the time, the athletes I'm working with, or the performers I'm working with, one of the barriers to them being able to be more consistent with their psychology and therefore their performance, is they don't understand it very well. And they haven't had to, because they've been good enough that they haven't had to address it yet.
Hal, any thoughts?
I'm taking it in. Yes, I think understanding oneself is really, really important if you want to play at a high level. And someone that's helping you must understand your inner mechanism of how you work. And that's what you're really talking about right there. And the coaches, and I know you don't like the coach, you like the consultant thing, but the ones that I worked with, that I had the most success with, I felt like tried to get inside me and feel like, okay, what are you trying to accomplish here? When they finally figured out what I was trying to accomplish, then they could help me a little bit. If they stayed and wanted to help me the way they wanted to help me and never really tried to understand me, then I didn't get very far with them. And is that what you're saying?
What you're talking about, Hal, is empathy, which is I'm not going to try to put my experience on you. I'm going to try to understand your experience. And in my role, what becomes surprising to many people is I never tell people what to think and do, for the simple reason, Hal, you're the only person who has to live with those, right? If I can help you understand how you think and feel, you get to think and act in ways that are in accordance with the things that you want, not what I want. And the relationship I try to build with my clients is a one-way street. I'm here for you to help you move toward the things that you want, not the other way around. And it sounds like you had a similar experience with the people that were able to help you, is that they understood you and were helping you figure out the ways that you get closer to the things you want.
That's totally right. So let's jump ship here for a second. Let's talk about the zone. In your mind, does that exist? And if so, how do you get a person to move towards that?
Yeah, it exists. I would call it flow state. That's kind of the more psychology term. In the zone, athletes call it zone. Performers, musicians, and actors call it being in the pocket. It's amazing. It's the optimal state of human functioning, right? It's a complete melding between us and the task at hand in our environment. It exists for sure, but it can be really elusive because there are a couple of things that need to fall into place for us to do it. Some are internally driven by us, and some are environment specific. But it's not so elusive that we can't get there. I want to clarify that we don't need to be in flow state to perform well. As a matter of fact, if you need to be in the optimal state of human functioning to perform well, you're probably not very good. However, there are things we can do to get closer. If we think about going into flow state or the zone as a doorway and passing through it, there are things that we can do to get closer to that doorway, making it more likely that we'll fall through more often, right? So even the most elite performers on the planet experience flow state about 10% of the time. And that 10%, we're not really sure when it comes. Sometimes it comes a little bit over here. Sometimes it comes a little bit over there. Sometimes it comes all at once and then we don't see it for a while. But if we understand the mechanisms behind it, we can get closer to it and experience it more often and be more consistent because we are closer to it. For example, the number one characteristic of flow state is being immersed in the present moment. That means we're focused on what we're doing when we're doing it. When we are off time, meaning that we are in the past or in the future, two timeframes that don't currently exist, it disrupts our ability to be immersed in that task at hand. So just learning how to recognize when we are not focused on the present and training our focus to come back to the present takes us a step closer to the door. And part of the reason that when we're in flow state, there's this distortion of time. It almost feels like time is moving exactly at the speed that we need it to. Sometimes it slows down, sometimes it speeds up, is not because time is actually distorting. It's because we are on time with life as it's playing out, right? With as little interference from the past and the future as possible, right? So that hence kind of the things that we experience in flow state makes total sense, right? The next thing we know is that flow state tends to have things feel easy. There's an ease. And the reason there's an ease is because we are creating as little interference between us and executing the thing that we want to do as possible. Part of the reason that we have that easiness and as little distortion is because in flow state, there's no ego attachment, which means we're not trying to protect our image or build our image or have some type of self-ego preservation. It's just about, can I do this thing as well as I can now, not for some ulterior motive, right? And so we can see if you have a fragile ego, it's really difficult to find flow state because you're not just performing, you're also performing to try to ensure some future down the road where you look okay or at least don't look bad. And then we also know in flow state that there's a non-goal striving, meaning I have intentions with what I'm trying to do, but I am not trying to assure some future-based outcome that doesn't exist yet and may never exist. And if you think about we talk about process focus and outcome focus, there's nothing wrong with goals and being outcome focused, but they're limiting to us at times because they by definition live in the past and the future. And so when we are attentionally and emotionally invested in them to the point where it disrupts us being able to focus on the thing that we're doing, it takes us farther and farther away from flow. So if we learn how to train ourselves to be present We learn how to address our insecurities in ways that limit the ego attachment to our performance, and understand how to direct our focus and efforts towards what's going on right now, rather than always being far off in the future. Even if it's a very near future, we can get closer to flow state more often, and then surprise, surprise, that's what helps kick us into it. And by the way, what's really awesome about when we are present and take our ego and future outcomes out of the equation is one of the other characteristics of flow state is it's really enjoyable.
So Raymond, I got to tell you something. That is by far the best definition I have ever heard of being in the zone, because you cannot be in the zone if you're not present. You cannot be in the zone if you haven't put the past aside and you totally accept what's going to happen in the future.
I can't tell how important the word you just said is, acceptance. We are now in psychology really starting to understand that if you want to build stable confidence and be present more often, there is an acceptance of the future and how it might play out, not I have to control the future. Like, instead of projecting the future and always trying to make sure it happens, it goes, hey, if you look, I think Victor Hovland won either last week or the week before, and someone asked him about it, and he was like, I hit it, and where it goes, I'm willing to live with it. That's acceptance, right? And that is a powerful place, for the reason being, it opens me up to be present more often. And I'm not worried about the future. I might not like it. I might not be satisfied with it. It might even make me uncomfortable. But if I am willing to accept it, it means I don't have to be scared of it. And if I don't have to be scared of it, I can pursue the things that I want.
Amen. That's all I know to say to that. Amen.
You guys listen at home, rewind for about 5 or 6 minutes and hear that again, because Hal and I were shaking our head yes the whole time Raymond was talking. Raymond, I love what you said, process focus versus outcome focus, because we talk about process versus results. Stay in the process and let the results take care of itself. I'm curious your thoughts on students that come in and say they hit it great on the range and can't take it to the golf course. I mean, we can get into the time and the amount of time between each shot from the golf course to the range, and there's a lot of factors there. But I'd love your a quick take on somebody that says they're Ranger Rick and can hit it great on the range, but just has a heck of a time taking it to the golf course, and how you would try and help them.
Yeah, I would want to understand more about what that particular player, the difficulties they are having taking it to the range. But for the purpose of this podcast, I'll just say what that says to me is they have unstable confidence, right? They are creating confidence from unstable sources. And then when they go to an environment where more stable confidence is required, it doesn't transfer over, right? So unstable confidence most often, and by the way, even the best players in the world have this, is they go, if I hit a good shot, then I will feel confident. And it creates this trap loop where I'm putting a ton of pressure on myself to hit a good shot, which really means I'm putting a ton of pressure on myself not to hit a bad shot. Then I'm more likely to not get the result that I want. And then I put even more pressure on myself to hit another good shot. Or it's not uncommon that pros will tell me, well, if I hit a bad shot, I feel like I got to hit 5 good ones before I'm confident enough to hit another one, right? And so if you're on the range, it's easy to have a high level of acceptance because there's no stakes involved. And so the confidence on the range is often situation generated, not self-generated. And when you're really the only source of stable confidence is a credible inner dialogue. That means when I say something to myself, it's meaningful, it makes sense, and I believe it. So on the range, when you go, hey, hit this thing, don't worry about where it goes, it's easy because it doesn't matter where it goes. But if you haven't actually built self-driven acceptance from how you're thinking, when you walk over to the first tee and you go, hey, just let it rip, don't worry about it goes, internally you're going, nope, you better make sure this thing doesn't go left, you better make sure it doesn't go right. And ultimately what happens is the inner dialogue loses all credibility because it's not built on, their confidence is not built on stable sources. Now, don't get me wrong, hitting good shots is a confidence booster, but it's unstable because it only lasts as long as it lasts.
So how do we make it more stable? How do we, kind of goes back to the zone stuff. How do we tell our 5 handicaps to get into more of a flow-like state at home when the stakes aren't as high, all that stuff?
Yeah. I think pushing people toward flow state is not helpful. I would be very wary of people in my position who are trying to bottle up flow state and sell it, for the reason being, one of the primary predictors of not being in flow state and not being present is trying to force flow state. right? Same with the golf swing. One of the primary predictors of hitting a bad golf shot is trying to force a swing to make a good golf shot, right? So what you're really trying to do, if we're trying to improve the stability of somebody's confidence, is to understand the thoughts behind it that are creating the instability. It usually comes in two pieces. The first piece is they are taking an event that they either want to happen or would like not to happen and turning it into an absolute necessity, right? So for example, they might go, I have to hit the first fairway. Okay. So they're taking something that would be very helpful and preferred and turning it into it either is or it isn't. The second part of that is they are taking whether that event works out and creating consequences that are more threatening than actually exist. And by definition, adding things that don't exist to it. So for example, they might go, I have to hit the first fairway. And if I don't, I'm going to have a terrible round of golf. Right. And what happens is, by the way, you can miss the first fairway and still have a great round of golf. It might not be exactly how you want to start, but how many times have players missed the first fairway, right? Then you start getting into the kind of the deeper levels of humans where they go, if I don't play well, that means I'm not a good golfer. So they have closed the window at the top for them being, they have closed the window for their availability to be confident. We look at people who are really happy, healthy, and confident. They have a wider window of things that can help them be confident, not a narrower window. Like on the very extreme end of that spectrum, a narrow window where I can only have one thing that makes me confident, happy, and feel good is the recipe for addiction, right? Then on the bottom of that thought, because they have closed that window, they have also created consequences that elicit our threat response, right? And in our threat response, we get safe. Hence why we make safe, steery swings. If I go, I have to hit this shot perfectly, or else that means that everything I've done in my life is a complete waste. I have a pessimistic explanation of what's happening that doesn't really exist. And it's about a future that doesn't exist yet, right? And so if you're saying, hey, go to the first tee and just turn it loose, don't worry about anything. But underneath, they have that shape of a thought, good luck, right? And this happens for all human beings. Like we close the windows for what it means to be successful unnecessarily often. And we create consequences that are more threatening and more punitive that don't actually exist all the time. And if we are not aware of when we are doing that and understand the actual words we are using to ourselves that do that by paying attention to them, we're hoping that the situation aligns in a way that allows us to play freely. And this is why you see people, they play their front nine at 5, like well above their skill level. And then they look down and go, and then the back nine is a total disaster because they have a thought, if I cannot screw this up because if I do, the front nine was a fluke, right? And then they start playing safe, and college golfers do this all the time.
So, wow, I'm still trying to take in all that right there. So, Raymond,
I'll let you clarify.
So, mistakes. One of the flaws that I see people come in here, they think tour players hit every shot perfect, never make a mistake. They don't make a mental mistake, which is complete bogus. They make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
And, I had a friend of mine tell me, he said, I'll just never cut out all the mistakes. And I said to him, John, no one will cut out all the mistakes, and address that.
How the bigger theme I'm hearing you talk about is our relationship with failure, right? And oftentimes we see, again, so here's how we explain things. Most of the time we explain failure to ourselves as it is a really bad thing, not just a setback or a temporary. Like we make it more permanent, more pervasive, and more personal than it really is. And
Right.
If we're looking at the value of failure, we can learn from our successes. We also learn from our failures, but we won't learn from them if the way we are explaining them to ourselves makes it seem like, one, we're not supposed to be having them, which we are. You cannot be successful at a certain level if you have not failed enough to get there.
That's right.
Quite literally, because you couldn't learn enough to be that successful that consistently. And then what happens is we start to learn to fear it, right? And so if we're just talking basic definition, fear of failure is I cannot fail because if I do, and then fill in whatever extra long-term, super pervasive and really personal explanation behind it. And of course, we're going to try to avoid failure all the time. People who have really stable confidence do not fail any less than people who don't. It's just that it doesn't derail them because they find it valuable. They might not like it. They might not be satisfied with it. And they sure as hell aren't comfortable with it all the time, but it is food for their growth and not the other way around. So people who are more optimistic, meaning they explain failures as temporary, more specific to what happened and non-personal, they don't make mountains out of molehills. And when they learn from failure, whereas people who explain failure pessimistically, long-term, pervasive, and personal, learn to fear failure. And fear of failure is, I mean, if you want to absolutely destabilize confidence, that's how you do it. And also, it makes what we're doing not enjoyable at all. Like playing a round of golf worried about stuff all the time is just no fun.
Wow. Let's talk about chipping for a minute. People got chipping yips out there. So how do you deal with yips?
Yeah. So yips come, it's important to understand where the yips come from. The yips come from that trap loop, and it becomes a very pessimistic trap loop where I go, I absolutely must execute this well, and then fill in whatever really threatening pessimistic explanation. And that loop goes around and around, and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter until we feel that we absolutely must make this putt, chip this close, et cetera, et cetera. And if we don't, the perceived consequences are so threatening that the survival portions of our brain just take over. And it's not about how do I thrive with this shot. It's just how do I get it over with so that I can get out of this feeling, right? It is literally our brain going, just do something to get out of here. It is an ultimate escape strategy, right? So dealing with, you have to address the thoughts that are creating that trap loop. There's no amount of good chips you can hit to get out of the yips. You have to take the thought and step out of the trap loop in order to do that. And to do that, you have to address the thoughts behind it that are creating that constriction and that threat that is getting ever tighter and ever tighter, and work backwards from it. And then what's very likely is you'll also have to address that trap loop and those yips as a habit, because what happens is the more we yip, the more likely our brain is to yip, and then the more likely it is to yip. And it's actually like grooving neurological pathways in our brain that when I get into this situation or similar situations, bail out, because that'll keep you safe, even though it's not what it's really doing. But to our brain, that makes total sense. And unless you build an awareness to when that reaction starts and addressing that habit, and addressing the thoughts behind it, you're hoping to play your way out of it. And that could take who knows how long, and you might not ever get out of it. And usually what happens is we get out of it because we chip so bad or putt so bad for so long that we throw our hands up and go, I don't even care what happens, which again is situational acceptance, not self-driven acceptance, which there's nothing wrong with that. The issue is you might lose your tour card by then, or you're in a tournament and you might not have a chance to win. And it comes at a great cost because it takes so long.
So you're saying someone can get out of the yips pretty quickly if they go through that process?
I think that is the fastest route out of the yips, right? Because the yips is just us in a full-on threat response that is not just, it's more self-imposed than externally imposed. And if you address the thoughts and discredit them in a way where you go, oh yeah, that makes sense, it is faster. And by the way, I don't make that easy, because going against the grain of how our brain is designed is not always the easiest thing, but it is the most efficient route to it.
So
Raymond, you can throw Band-Aids on it too. You can change your grip, you can change your putter, you can use a different style. But ultimately what happens is if you start doing that and you start putting better, you get a brief response usually, and then the cycle typically just starts again, or it's likely to just start again because you haven't actually addressed the source of where the yips is coming from.
Yeah.
And Raymond, wouldn't you say that like the brain is literally trying to protect you? It's trying to help you, right? It's like a hot burning stove. It's trying to say it's hot, keep your hand away. And that's right. Every time you get into that chipping position that scares you, your brain's saying fight or, fly, see ya, I'm out, The quick question too, would you say that, I wrote down process focus, outcome focus. I really like that. Isn't it? You've got to completely, like I gave a lesson to a guy with chipping hips this morning and said, process. What are you trying to do on this shot? Not worried about where it might go. And you almost have to have this carefree, like, I don't care where it might go. As long as I can stick to the process, I can pat myself on the back and say, I committed and executed what I was trying to do. Yeah,
Chase, as long as that is authentic. Again, if my thought is this has to go well for me to feel whatever,
validated,
whatever, right? The idea that you're going to not care about where a ball goes is pretty unlikely. And again, I don't want to make acceptance sound like you don't care where it goes. Like the players I work with who develop robust acceptance still care where the ball goes. If you didn't care where the ball went at all, you wouldn't even bother lining up for the shot, right? Like you would just hit it and wherever it goes, I don't care. It's not about not caring. It's about that acceptance of, if I can accept the future, even the ones that I don't like, then I'm not so emotionally and attentionally beholden to future outcomes, which allows me to be process focused. So just telling someone, focus on the process, while they are deeply attentionally and emotionally invested in an outcome for a reason that is very, as you mentioned, really reinforcing to their brain because it thinks it's keeping them safe, they're not going to be focused on the process, right? Which is really important to understand how our brain works. The primary function of our brain is to keep us alive. And so if we're in a setting that requires thriving, we have to recognize those settings and address our relationship with future outcomes. Otherwise, we are not going to be focused on the process, right? So let's say I have a deep ego attachment to a future outcome, the result of a tournament, because that will validate me as a pro or do whatever. Again, nothing wrong with that. But that is going to draw my focus to future outcomes. So then the idea that I'm just going, hey, just be process focused, particularly when those results are at stake, is pretty unlikely. Where I would say as an instructor is you can ask this person, what's keeping you so attached to the future outcome instead of what it is that we're trying to do? And chances are there's going to be some level of feeling like they need it in order to, and then fill in whatever blank at the end. And if you can address that in a way like Hal said, like, no, it's not about not making mistakes. It's about, like, mistakes are a baked in part of the process, and making them, yeah, it's not great, but it's also not awful. Then that allows us to step away from the future because we don't feel like we have to protect ourselves from it.
So here's a scenario. I was guilty of this in my career, and I see a lot of kids that are guilty of this. I'm only worthy if I perform at this level. My identity is basically only as good as I perform. When you run across that with a kid, what do you do?
Al, that is so common. It's becoming more and more common given the social media world that young people are growing up in, but adults as well. Look, especially it's really almost assured for people who are really good at something early. Right. So when we're young, we're still forming our identity. Like, who the hell am I? And the easiest things to attach to are the stuff that we're good at. And we get reinforced from the adults in our lives. And it creates what you're talking about, I call a coupling of self and craft, which is I take me and I interchange it with the thing that I do. And again, I want to make it really clear. People who are really good at what they do are personally invested in it. The danger with the coupling of self and craft is it creates that trap loop that we're talking about, which is I have to play well to be okay with who I am. And the window for doing so as you get better gets smaller. So when you're on the lower end of the learning curve and minimal effort and minimal practice produces progress, we go, I feel great about myself. But what happens is you get to the point in the learning curve where your current competency can't cover that space anymore. And the window for you being able to say you feel good about yourself gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the damage for not hitting that window becomes really punitive to people. Like, there's very few things we as humans find more aversive than self-loathing, right? And as you do that, what happens is now you are going to be drawn to the future, because in the future, you are going to feel terrible about yourself if this thing doesn't go well. And it creates this trap loop. It is so dangerous, Hal. I can't even get you started on it. If we're talking about the ramifications for that on our mental health, it's a recipe for anxiety. It's a recipe for depression if it goes on for long enough. It is a recipe for burnout, not overtraining, but burnout, because we have created a relationship with our craft that in conditions that cannot be met. And the better we get, the smaller the window is for us being able to do that. And it's not a matter of if that catches up with you, it's a matter of when.
I knew it was bad.
Yeah. And don't also want to make it sound like just don't ever do that. Because if your profession is to play professional golf or to sing or to act or whatever your profession is, the idea that you are not going to layer some level of yourself into that, I don't think that's really possible. If you're really going to be passionate about something, we layers of ourselves into the things that we are passionate about. But when it passes this threshold where if it doesn't go well, I actually feel bad for extended periods of time, and not just that the thing didn't go well, but I feel bad as personally, right? So that's that third part of that pessimistic explanatory style. It's a personal conclusion, a personal indictment of our self-worth and value. Then the cost of failure is too high. And then so if you're trying to build stable confidence, and what stable confidence does is give us credible permission to go for the things we want. We are never going to give ourselves permission to go for it if the cost is that high to us. Hence why at every level of golf, I am observing more, whether it's the transition from AJJ to college to mini tour to pro, people who have this coupling of self and craft, these players, they tend to weed themselves out pretty quickly, or they get burnt out when they get to the next level because their conditions are too competitive for them to be able to feel good about themselves. It's hard, it's really difficult.
Raymond, what's your take on goal setting?
Mixed. So I think it's really important for us as people to have an idea of what we want to do and why we want to do it. There's no doubt about that. But goal setting is limited. If we look at the research around goal setting right now, the most of the research in the 80s was just like goal set, the higher the goals, the better, and the more confident you'll be. And what we're seeing now is actually that's not necessarily the case. People who are really successful and also really fulfilled with the things they're doing, they have ideas about what they want to do. They have a vision for them, their program, their careers, their businesses, their families, etc. But what we're finding more is people that are really more consistent, particularly under more challenging conditions, are more values-based, right? And so if we think about what we're here are the three things we're finding. When people are more goal-oriented, they're not immersed in the task at hand as much as people who are values-oriented. For the reason being, simple thing, goals live in the past and in the future. And so if we have one eye on our goals, we can't also be fully immersed in the thing that we're doing. And so we're finding that when we are overly goal-oriented, and even lofty goals, it draws our attention away. The second thing is we see that people get with an over-attachment to outcome-based goals give really inconsistent effort. And that is when our goals are so big and so far away, it becomes very easy to be complacent. And I'm not working hard enough because they're still way the hell out there, right? And then as they get closer, we tend to try too hard because we're trying to force them to happen. And it takes us off time and we're focused on something. We're essentially multitasking, and human beings are terrible multitaskers. There are a lot of research studies that show we get as much as 10 IQ points lower when we're multitasking, which means we are 10% significantly dumber multitasking, right? And then what really happens is once we get to a point where goals are out of our reach, which sometimes they are, we tend to quit, right? Because if I go, I have to have that goal in order for whatever, and anything else is less than, once we get there, or it becomes out of reach. So this is why players, I had a terrible front nine. The back nine was great because they just don't care, right? But you can't get away with that playing at higher levels and if you want to be consistent, which is why we quit. Like if a goal's not in reach and that's the thing that I am emotionally and attentionally attached to, when it's not available to me, the next logical conclusion, well then why would I keep trying, right? And then the last thing that is particularly dangerous in terms of goal setting, or maybe not dangerous, but limiting, is that we see people who are really outcome oriented. They don't take calculated risks because they're always trying to preserve the goal rather than actually pursue it. And so values, on the other hand, we're seeing that people who are values oriented, values are principles and themes that are important to us. So a goal would be like win a major. A value would be something like competitiveness, right? The value is something that is immediately accessible and actionable to us at all times, right? And so what we see is people tend to be more present because competitiveness is available to us in the present moment, and we can apply it to whatever we're doing. We also apply more consistent effort because I can apply being competitive to effort that is in preparation for something way in the distance, to something that's happening right now, and in any condition, whether I'm playing well, playing poorly, whatever, I always have the option to be competitive if that's important to me. And then the last is, it gives us good reason to go for the things that we want because we're not trying to preserve something. I'm always able to be competitive. I don't have to protect a future where I might not be able to be competitive. I can always do it. And so it gives me license to go, you know what? Be present, be consistent with my effort whenever I'm applying it, mostly right now. And when the time comes for me to go, hey, there's that thing I want, now I can go for it, right? And again, I don't want to make it sound like that's easy. And goals are important, but they're not nearly as valuable as we once thought they were.
So you used the term calculated risk. In order to reach higher levels, you must take calculated risk. Can you expound on that a little bit for us?
Hal, I just finished writing the closing thoughts to my book that's coming out next year. The closing statements revolve something around this, which is that very rarely are the best performers in the world the most talented people. What happens is when there are opportunities for them to take the risks necessary to be successful, they take them more often than people who won't. And just because you're really talented does not mean that you will take that risk. Now, again, I'm not talking about cutting every corner, firing at every flag. What I'm talking about, in the back nine of a major, they're willing to risk the fact that they might finish tied 10th to have a chance to win. Whereas people who go, yeesh, I just don't want to finish outside the top 10, will probably finish in 8th, but never have a chance to win. And when you do that over a long period of time, those people separate themselves from other people in terms, and you're absolutely right. Risk and failure and mistakes and all those things are absolutely required in order to be successful. And I'll just say, Hal, I don't think we live very enjoyable and fulfilling lives if we don't ever take risks. You know, if you ask people on their deathbed, what are their deepest regrets? It's the things they didn't do, not the things that they did. Nobody ever says, I shouldn't have fired at that flag when I had a chance to win. They go, I wish I would have played more aggressively, right? And again, I'm not telling people when and where they should, but they regret the things they didn't do, not the things that they did. And if you don't take those risks, you can't get those things unless a bunch of stars align and someone just drops it to you, which is really few and far between.
So I have to ask you a question, Raymond. How old are you?
I am 38 years old.
Are you? 38. You weren't even born yet when I was starting out my career. Boy, do I wish I had known you whenever I was starting out my career. Because I got to tell you something, the things that took me 40 years to learn, you are describing as deeply as I could ever possibly put it into words. I'm not smart enough to put it into words, what you just have done. But I will tell you, 40 years of experience taught me what you just put into words. I hope everybody out there is listening to what you've got to say right now.
Hal, I would just say the reason I understand this is because we've been studying your experiences. Your 40 years didn't just teach it to you in that time. It also taught it to me. I was just the beneficiary of being able to sit down and read it and try to understand it. But all that we understand about flow state, about stable confidence, about risk taking, all these things are because we've been studying people who have been doing it and the things that they do that make them successful and the things that get in the way of it. So I appreciate your sentiments very much. It means a great deal coming from me. There are a lot of people that are very jealous that I'm getting to talk to you today, but I don't want to make it sound like I came up with this. I'm a custodian for this information, but when we understand it and we can train it, it opens us up. We don't have to wait 40 years to figure it out, but people should be thanking you for that.
Well, here's something you just said that was also very dynamic. We are all custodians of what we know. We own none of it, but yet we reach some points in our life where we think, man, I figured this out. I own this. Well, you know, we're just figuring out something somebody else learned.
And all the things that we've been talking about today, how I'm standing on the shoulders of a bazillion performers who have been willing to be studied and observed, and all the researchers that have done it. And by the way, the clients that I've been working with and have made mistakes with in 12 years. getting to this point, and I'm not trying to tout that I'm amazing or an expert or anything like that, but the things that I know have come from great toil, not from just, oh, I just know it.
Yeah.
Well,
Amen.
You've been quite impressive so far, Raymond. Don't short side yourself. I want to go back to something you said that I think was really interesting. You said that this was at the very beginning, in order to get to know your players, you do a comprehensive kind of analysis, and you're basically learning more about them as you get to know them better and all that stuff, as you work with them longer. Help us, Hal and I, and even any coaches listen to this, help us. How would you recommend that we get to know our players better? Is there a personality profile test? Is there any kind of test that you recommend? I see you smiling about that. And then also, what are ways at which you, working with say we send one of our mini tour players or one of our tour players to you, what are some of the ways that you try and get to know your players?
Yeah. The very simple answer with that is ask questions that you would want people to ask you. Knowing the theory and the frameworks that I know psychologically are going to guide a lot of the questions I ask. For example, ask people, how do you find success, right? What has your experience been like? If I'm asking about people's golfing history because I want to know how fast they get better, because that's going to clue me into a little bit of some of the challenges that come with that are baked in, what their relationship with failure and success is like, et cetera, et cetera. So you're asking a lot of questions, just really trying to understand their experience. What motivates them? What gets in their way? What keeps them from playing the ways that they want to? What allows them to play that they want to? It's a pretty deep conversation. The first session I have with people usually lasts like more than an hour, right? And it's not really us doing any psychology work. It's me, like, I need to understand you and your experience and what it is that you're trying to do in a comprehensive way, that I'm not guessing at anything and trying to put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. And you are actually learning things that you need to learn as we build this relationship together. The second part of your question was,
I guess my thing for anybody listening at home, what are some ways at which they can even kind of learn more about themselves that could then help them apply some of the mindset stuff, some of the acceptance stuff on the golf course?
The first thing you can do is just learn to sit with your own thoughts. I'd say one of the primary barriers for people right now is that we live in an environment where we don't ever have to sit with our own thoughts, especially the ones that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with, right? We can jump to our cell phone, we can jump to television, we can do all these things. And I don't want to be the old guy on the lawn saying technology is bad and social media is the worst, but it is training us to not really know ourselves because we don't ever sit with ourselves. So one thing you can do is just sit with your own thoughts. That's the beginning of mindfulness training, and being able to connect with your breath and observe your thoughts wherever they go without trying to fix them or judge them or whatever. I mean, a lot of the players I work with, they are scared of their thoughts, right? They're worried, if I have a negative thought, then I'm in trouble, because their relationship with their thoughts currently is, if it exists, it must be true, and therefore it is going to impact my actions. And if we're going to address a lot of the things that keep us from experiencing being present and having more stable confidence, that's going to start with, can I sit with some stuff that's more uncomfortable for me? So just being able to sit with your own thoughts would be a great place to start. And then just on a really tangible level, go read some really good books. I mean, I can throw a couple, you can put them in the comments of the podcast. Listen to podcasts like this where people are talking about and discussing performance on deeper levels than just, this is what happened in the game and this is what coverage they ran, or this is how far you hit the ball and all this stuff. And think about it on deeper levels. And once you start to do that, you start to peel back those layers, you get a more comprehensive understanding. And then just overall, like, take ownership of it. Like, so often I see that athletes of all skill levels and all ranges, they're leaving their psychology to chance, and they're not taking ownership of it. And that can look, you can work with someone like me, you can read a bunch of books and try to understand it better. You can watch podcasts. You can download one of the bazillion mindfulness apps that will help you sit with your thoughts. There's a lot that we can do, but those would be the best places to start, right? And listening to people talk about those types of topics in different ways is always a great place to start.
Okay, real quick, recommend two books and an app.
Yeah, if for somebody who is experiencing anxiety on the course, which is another way of saying unstable confidence, right? Anxiety by definition is worry about an uncertain future. There's a researcher out of Brown University. His name is Judson Brewer. He is arguably the world's foremost expert on anxiety and the habits behind it. He has an app called Unwinding Anxiety. Matter of fact, I wrote a section in my book based on his research, and then I had to go back and rewrite it because he then released a book that was so close to how I had summarized his research that it would have bordered on plagiarism. But he has an app called Unwinding Anxiety. It is a mindfulness-based approach to addressing anxiety. If you're looking for books, I would say there's a book called Mindset. It's by a researcher from Stanford University. Her name is Dr. Carol Dweck. She, quote unquote, discovered and coined the phrases growth mindset and fixed mindset. And those are two core beliefs about where ability comes from. One of them squeezes off access to your ability and makes every single performance venture an ego protection venture. And the other learns to deeply love effort and growth and see failure as feedback and valuable feedback. Be just a really great place to start. There's a new book out recently. I think it's called The Practice of Groundedness, which is about being present and how we can train that. And again, one of the themes that you're hearing from me a lot is this term mindfulness. Mindfulness has been around for about 2,600 years, but now the research behind us is telling us that it is the thing that allows us to develop emotional intelligence, emotional agility, and all these psychological terms that we hear. I'm not sure who the author is on that. I'll have to look it up. It just arrived at my house, but I flipped through about 50 pages last night, and it's right on.
Awesome.
Well, Raymond, I got to tell you something. I love this podcast. I really appreciate you being on today. You've helped me today. I know you've helped a lot of other people that are going to listen to this today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure. And if there's anything I can do for you, Chase, and your academy and the things that you're doing, please let me know. Well, we're definitely going to have you on, because I wrote down about 14 other questions that we could spend 3 hours on this thing getting into. Yeah. And you've it's funny. We talk a lot about some of the stuff that you talk about, but you just went at such a deeper level than it's making both of us grind a little bit to think on it a little bit. That's Chase, what I think is really important for us to understand, that there is something to be said about the power of simplicity, but it's really difficult to simplify something if you don't know it well enough to be able to simplify it. Like, if you think about how experts are able to make simple changes in real time, it's because they have a really comprehensive understanding of the thing. I had a client at my house last week, and we were talking about this process, and he said something along the lines of his father told him, simplicity is on the other side of complexity, right? And when we start to have these conversations and learn things in more in-depth ways, that allows us to then simplify it in the places that we really want to. Really good. Okay, I got one final question. I want you to take us home with this. Talk about nerves, pre-shot or pre-round jitters, handling first team nerves. What, you got a guy that calls you the morning before a tournament, the night before a tournament, and he's fighting some inner turmoil, jitter type stuff. Is it breathing? How do you get him to handle getting over the Ryder Cup first round tee shot? Yeah. Chase, are you talking nerves or are you talking anxiety? Because those are two different. That would be the first question I asked the person. So give us a quick little definition on your take on both of those, and then go into it. Nerves are a physiological reaction. It's our brain and body responding to things that are important to us when they are important to us, right? It feels funky at times. Heart rate's going to go up. Like, it's a cascade of physiological reactions, starting with our brain telling our body release cortisol. Cortisol is basically a small dose of adrenaline. That means our heart rate's going to go up. When our heart rate goes up, our breathing rate has to follow. The blood in our abdomen that protects our vital organs and runs our digestive functions moves from our abdomen to our limbs, hence the feeling of butterflies in your stomach. That's just blood moving out of your abdomen and out to your limbs, for the reason we need to be able to fight or freeze, right? That is a state of readiness. So nerves are about urgency and readiness to act right now. Anxiety is not. Anxiety is a fear-based emotion that is, by definition, worry about the future. So there is a dread component to it, right? If that person is feeling nervous, it starts with, can you first of all recognize that it's nerves? So if you're trying to ignore, the fastest way to let nerves become anxiety is to try to ignore them, right? So to own them, allow yourself to feel them and sit in them, because with nerves, they're transient. They come and go if we allow them to just exist without trying to force them or change them. And by the way, we get better at golf when we're nervous. And the moments of our lives that are most enjoyable are the ones when we're nervous. That's when we say I love you to somebody the first time, standing on the first tee at the Sloheim Cup and the Ryder Cup. I ask players all the time, what's your best moment in golf? And those are the two moments that come up the most. They're also the most nervous moments. Anxiety, on the other hand, comes from how we are thinking about the future. Specifically, as we've talked about before, is I've created a window that is immensely smaller than actually exists. And I've created consequences that if I don't hit that window are way more punitive than actually exist. And so anxiety, two things happen. You have to address the thought causing the anxiety. And the second thing is groundedness. So what's really important to understand about anxiety, the opposite of anxious is not relaxed. That's why telling somebody who's anxious to just relax does not work. The opposite of anxious is grounded, and that is present, right? So again, anxiety lives in the future, anger and frustration live in the past. The counterbalance to those is centered in the present moment, but you have to address the thought that is taking you out of the present moment first.
Okay, so nerves, heart rate goes up, tingly hands, the good side of nerves versus anxiety being the scared side of it, right? Is there a heart rate, like breathing? Do we want to try to slow down a little? Do we want to, what do you recommend?
You don't even have to slow it down, but if you can just connect with your breath. So again, there's a difference between just breathing, which we're doing all the time, and the term I would use with my clients is connecting with your breath, meaning your focus is on your breath and on your breath only. You don't have to change it. You don't have to speed it up or slow it down. You don't have to judge it like this is good or this is bad, but just, can I ground myself into my breath? On a neurological level, what that's doing is we are present for long enough that the survival portions of our brain can look around and go, oh, actually not a life-threatening event. And then the thriving portions of our brain, like our new brain, the younger structures that can think rationally and clearly, they come back online. It's really not an issue as long as we can recognize it and allow ourselves to ground and take a deep breath. But we don't need to fight that feeling. Like, can't tell you how many players tell me I hit the ball a lot farther and a lot better when I'm nervous. Great. You might have to adjust for it, which club you pick. So depending on how nervous you are. But anxiety is a different story. Anxiety gets in the way of us performing well, hence the danger of it. And contrary to popular belief that I've read in a lot of golf psychology books, a little bit of anxiety is not a good thing. The research around anxiety is really clear. It does not help us because it's rooted in fear and it motivates us to avoid things we don't want to happen, which is the fastest way to get right to it.
And we're not present. We're not grounded, just like you said.
Not grounded. We can be grounded being nervous, provided we know how to ground ourselves and we are willing to accept the fact that we feel that physical discomfort that comes with being nervous. The fundamental difference with nerves and anxiety is that anxiety is way off time, creating something that is very threatening to us, hence why we're worried about it. And we need to be able to ground ourselves, but we also have to address what is the thought pattern or the thought that is keeping us from being present in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Powerful.
Great stuff.
Yep.
Great stuff. Well, Raymond, thank you so much for coming on. It was awesome getting to meet you. Had always heard great stuff, and I think you blew us away, and you're gonna really impress a lot of our listeners, and they're gonna get a lot out of this. So thank you so much for spending some time with us, and we will definitely have you back on again to cover all the 25 notes I have written down here to cover next time.
Yeah, that'd be great, gentlemen. Thank you for having me. Happy holidays, by the way.
Happy holidays. Thanks, Raymond.
See ya.
Be the right club today. Yes!